All right, gang, we're going to try and get you ready here for tomorrow's lab. We're going to do a titration lab. And so I want to explain what that is. The goal of a titration is to determine the concentration, which is measured in molarity, of a basic solution. So we're going to have a solution that's basic, meaning it has a pH between 7 and 14, but we don't know the concentration. We don't know the molarity of it. We can determine the concentration by adding that to an acidic solution of a known concentration. So we're going to know exactly how much of the acid we have and how concentrated it is. Remember, we measure that in molarity. And by adding the two together, we can figure out the concentration of the base. All right, well, how do we do that? Well, this is kind of a quick diagram of what we're going to do when we're talking about a titration. So we have a couple things. Number one, right here we have what's called a conical flask. We're going to start with, in there we are going to have an acid. The acid is going to be hydrochloric acid, HCl. It's a strong acid. We're going to put exactly 10 milliliters in there, and we're going to know the exact concentration of that in here. And that's just showing we're going to add it to it. We're also then going to add an indicator, and I'll talk about that in a second, what that's used for. That's going to indicate or show us any kind of change in pH. So I'll talk about that in a second. Now this is the setup we're going to have, and this setup is called a titration. So on the top we have what's called a burette. You fill that with a liquid. In this case, it's going to be the base. It's a basic solution that we don't know the concentration for. So we're going to add that in here, and underneath it we're going to have our conical flask that has the acid. We're going to turn this little stopcock, it's called, and that's going to let the base flow out of the burette, and it'll start to fill up this conical flask. As it does that, the acid here and the base here are going to mix. As they mix, the pH goes closer and closer to 7. When it gets to 7, we've reached what we call the equilibrium point, and we stop. That's what we're after in the titration. Then once we do that, we can do some calculations and figure out the molarity of the base, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay? So let me give you more of a visual of what we're going to do. All right? How do you perform a titration experiment? So again, there's another picture showing the setup with the flask and the burette. But here it is. We're going to take, this is 25. We're going to go 10 milliliters of hydrochloric acid. And we're going to add that here to the flask. This is the conical flask. It's a unique shaped container. It's really good for stirring or swirling solutions. So this is HCl, hydrochloric acid. We know exactly the molarity, the concentration, and we know how much we're going to put it in. Now we're going to use a graduated cylinder. They're using kind of a pipette. That's a little more complex than we need to be. Here they're adding what's called phenolphthalein, and that's an indicator. What happens with this, if you have phenolphthalein, that's quite a mouthful right here, gee whiz, but if you add phenolphthalein to a solution that's acidic, it has no color. So here's hydrochloric acid. We just added a couple drops in. It doesn't show up. You can't see it. But as soon as the pH increases and gets to 7, and even goes into the basic side and goes to 8, 9, or 10, when it becomes basic, that phenolphthalein all of a sudden will glow a bright pink. It's called an indicator. It tells us, hey, we have a base. We no longer have an acid, we have a base. So we're going to put that in the conical flask, and when we add base to it from the top, coming down from the burette, you'll see it'll turn pink. Now, it won't stay around for very long. It'll disappear. We're going to swirl it. Here's why we use the conical flask, because it's really good for swirling. All right. Now, in the burette, we're going to add sodium hydroxide, NaOH. All right. We don't know the molarity of it. This is the unknown. This is what we're trying to figure out. So we're going to add this to the burette. Okay. Now, once we do that, the burette's going to be full, and we'll show you where to get it to. We're going to open the burette, and when we do that, the sodium hydroxide flows out into the flask. Now remember, the sodium hydroxide, which is up here in the burette, is basic. When it lands in the acid down here, which again is in the conical flask, notice that the indicator turns pink. We're going to keep swirling it. We turn off, and all of a sudden what happened? It disappeared. Now, why did it disappear? I have more acid down here than I have base. And so overall, this solution is still acidic. So that indicator, that phenolphthalein, disappears. So I want to keep adding. I'm going to add a little bit more. I'm going to turn the burette. I'm going to let a few drops out. Now notice I'm not adding a ton. I'm just adding a little bit. And a little bit more. I continue to swirl it. There's a little bit more. The solution turns pink, but it goes to colorless. And what does that mean? That means it's still an acidic solution. I'm going to keep adding drop by drop. Now you got to be careful. If you add too much, you're going to go past what we call the equilibrium point or the equivalency point. We don't want to do that. We want to add it drop by drop by drop. The great thing about the burette, and you can see at the top, this little stopper, you can turn it and just add one drop at a time. You don't want to let it flow. If you let it flow, you'll let too much and you won't be able to measure it. So we're going one drop, swirl, one drop, swirl, one drop, swirl. And we're going to keep doing that until we get an overall color change. Now notice it stays pink for a little bit longer. What does that tell me? That tells me I'm still acidic. The solution down here is still acidic, but it's getting closer to 7. Oh, it still went away. So you want to turn off the burette. We're going to keep going and one drop and swirl, one drop and swirl, one drop and swirl. When you feel like, hey, it's not turning clear right away, it's lingering a little bit longer, careful, heads up, it's about to get there. Now we're getting a little closer. We're going to drop a few more. Ooh, and that might be too little. All right, there we go. Now, notice we swirl and it no longer goes colorless. Now it's pink. We stop. We are no longer letting any more out of the burette. Okay, what we've done is what we call neutralizing the acid. The acid is no longer acidic. Now I have equal concentration acid and equal concentration base, and I've created a neutral solution. Okay? Now, once I do that, I stop. I am no longer going to let any more out of the burette. I want to go and say, well, how much left? So I'm going to eyeball it. Now, what I want to do, if you see that little dip here is called a meniscus. I want to go to the bottom here. I'm not looking at the top, I'm looking at the bottom. So the bottom, if I were to read that, now if you notice it goes from the top down. This is about 25, I'd say 25.4 milliliters. Okay? And so I would record in my data, hey, in order to neutralize the acid, I had to put in 25.4 milliliters, and that neutralized the hydrochloric acid. And I'm going to stop. Now, we're going to try and do this 3 times. So I'm going to drain it out. I'm going to clean it out. I'm going to rinse it. I'm going to start again. And I want to do it 3 times. We'll explain more of that on Friday. And we want to repeat the experiment so we can get it close. All right? And then Tuesday when we come back, the next class period, we'll go through some of the calculations. But tomorrow in the class, we want to actually do the titrations itself. So hopefully this is just going to give you an idea of what it's supposed to look like, what we're doing. Again, think of this. We start out with the acid. All right, we're gonna put 10 milliliters of acid in. We're going to put a few drops of that phenolphthalein indicator. We're going to fill a burette with a base, which is sodium hydroxide. And we're going to drip a little bit at a time, swirl, drip and swirl, drip and swirl until the color stays pink. As soon as it's pink, we stop it. We measure, hey, how much did I use? You can see I went from here to here. I'm going to record that, and then I'm going to do it 2 more times. So hopefully you have a better idea of titrations. All right.